March 6, 1944, 32,000 feet above the Reich capital. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler banked his Messerschmitt BF 109 through crystalline air, scanning westward for the American bomber formations that intelligence had reported approaching Berlin. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had owned these skies. British bombers came only at night, and American heavy bombers, when they dared to penetrate this deep into German airspace, arrived alone and vulnerable. The fuel mathematics were simple, brutally so. No Allied fighter possessed the range to escort bombers from England to Berlin and return. The distance exceeded every operational parameter that aerial warfare had established since 1939. German pilots had calculated these numbers with the precision of accountants, understanding that geography itself provided Germany's most effective air defense. 800 miles separated Berlin from Allied airfields in England. 1,600 miles. Round trip through hostile airspace, where every gallon of fuel translated directly into minutes of survival time over enemy territory. Stigler's wingman, Lieutenant Werner Schroer, maintained formation 300 meters to his right, both pilots conducting the methodical visual search that combat experience had refined into unconscious habit. Below them, the city of Berlin spread across the landscape like a detailed map, its factories and rail yards representing industrial capacity that Allied bombers had been attempting to destroy for months with limited success. Without fighter escort, those bomber formations paid devastating prices for every ton of ordnance they delivered. The radio crackled with routine traffic from ground controllers tracking the approaching American formation, estimated time to target, altitude reports, and defensive fighter dispositions that would transform Berlin's airspace into a killing zone where German interceptors held every tactical advantage. Stigler had flown this mission profile dozens of times, engaging heavy bombers that arrived without escort, their defensive gun positions providing inadequate protection against coordinated fighter attacks. Then Schroer's voice cut through the radio frequency with urgency that made Stigler's attention snap westward. Achtung! Fighters at 10 o'clock high, climbing through our altitude. Stigler's eyes found them immediately. Silver aircraft with distinctive inline engines and bubble canopies that could only be American P-51 Mustangs, flying in loose formation that suggested combat readiness rather than the tight defensive groupings that characterized short-range fighters operating at their maximum endurance. But this was impossible. The Mustang's published combat radius was 475 miles, barely sufficient to reach Western Germany and return to England. Berlin lay 800 miles from Allied bases, 300 miles beyond any American fighter's operational capability. German intelligence had been emphatic on this point. No Allied fighter could escort bombers to Berlin. The fuel capacity did not exist. The engine endurance could not be sustained. The navigation challenges over that distance exceeded practical pilot capability. Yet here they were, 20 or more Mustangs flying combat air patrol over the Reich capital, as though the laws of physics and fuel consumption had been suspended specifically to contradict every assumption German air defense planning had relied upon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans maintained altitude advantage, positioning themselves between the approaching bomber formation and the German interceptors, standard escort doctrine, but executed 800 miles from their home bases in a demonstration of range capability that should have been technically impossible. Stigler's mind raced through calculations that refused to resolve into coherent answers. Fuel consumption, at cruise power settings, combat reserve requirements, navigation time over hostile territory. Every variable pointed toward the same conclusion. These American fighters should not be here. The engagement began with the mechanical precision that characterized aerial combat between experienced pilots. German fighters attempted to position themselves for attacks on the bomber formation, while American escorts maneuvered to block those approaches. But something fundamental had shifted in the tactical equation. The Mustang pilots were not flying with the desperate fuel conservation that marked fighters operating at maximum range. They were aggressive, confident, Maintaining combat power settings that suggested substantial fuel reserves remained despite having flown 800 miles to reach Berlin. Stigler rolled his Messerschmitt into an attack position, targeting a B-17, flying fortress on the formation's southern flank. His BF-109 responded with the crisp handling that 3 years of combat experience had taught him to exploit, diving toward the bomber at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. Standard attack profile, proven effective against unescorted heavy bombers whose defensive guns could not track fighters approaching from directly ahead. But before Stigler could close to effective firing range, 2 Mustangs dropped from their patrol altitude, intercepting his attack vector with speed and positioning that forced him into defensive maneuvering. The American fighters pursued through his evasive turns, maintaining pressure that consumed fuel at rates far above efficient cruise settings. These pilots were not worried about fuel reserves. They were flying as though Berlin were 50 miles from their base rather than 800. The dogfight expanded across 30,000 feet of vertical airspace as more German fighters attempted to break through the American escort screen. Each engagement demonstrated the same disturbing reality. The Mustangs were not operating at the limits of their fuel capacity. They were fighting with the confidence of pilots who possessed adequate reserves for sustained combat maneuvering, something that should have been impossible this far from Allied bases. Werner Schroer's Messerschmitt took hits from a Mustang's 50 caliber machine guns during a turning engagement that lasted less than 30 seconds. Stigler watched his wingman's aircraft trail smoke as it entered a shallow dive toward lower altitude, the pilot's voice reporting engine damage over the radio frequency that connected all German fighters in the Berlin defense sector. Another experienced pilot forced to withdraw from combat by an American fighter that had no business being 800 miles from England with sufficient fuel remaining for aggressive air-to-air maneuvering. The bomber formation released its ordnance over Berlin's industrial sectors, while American escort fighters maintained defensive positions that prevented effective German attacks. Stigler and the surviving members of his squadron attempted multiple approach vectors, each one blocked by Mustang pilots who demonstrated none of the fuel conservation behavior that should have characterized fighters operating at extreme range. The Americans were maintaining combat power, conducting coordinated maneuvers, and engaging German interceptors with tactical flexibility that required substantial fuel reserves. As the American formation turned westward for the return flight to England, Stigler's fuel gauges showed levels that required immediate return to base. His combat sortie had lasted 45 minutes, all of it conducted over friendly territory within 50 miles of multiple emergency landing fields. The Mustang pilots had been airborne for over 4 hours, conducted combat operations 800 miles from their 5E bases, and were now facing another 4-hour return flight across hostile territory, where emergency landing options did not exist. The mathematics remained impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. American fighters were escorting bombers to Berlin and returning to England, accomplishing missions that German planners had calculated to be beyond the operational capability of any existing fighter aircraft. Stigler landed at Rechlin Airfield 15 minutes later, his fuel tanks showing just sufficient capacity for standard approach and landing procedures. He climbed from his cockpit into afternoon air that smelled of high-octane aviation fuel and hot metal, his mind still processing what he had witnessed at 32,000 feet over Berlin. Ground crew personnel were already inspecting his aircraft for damage, their routine efficiency suggesting they had not yet heard reports from pilots who had encountered American fighters over the capital. The debriefing session in Rechlin's operations building transformed confusion into institutional denial. Squadron commanders listened to combat reports describing American fighters escorting bombers to Berlin with expressions that suggested they were hearing accounts of mechanical failures rather than tactical intelligence. Major Hans Assi Hahn, commanding officer of the fighter wing, interrupted Stigler's description of the engagement with questions that revealed how deeply the American range capability contradicted German planning assumptions. "You are certain these were P-51 Mustangs conducting combat operations over Berlin?" Hahn's tone carried skepticism that stopped just short of accusation. "Not reconnaissance aircraft that happened to be transiting the area during the bomber raid?" Stigler had flown against Allied fighters since 1940, engaging Spitfires over England, Hurricanes over the Channel, and various American types over occupied Europe. He recognized the Mustang's distinctive profile, its Packard-built Merlin engine note, and its handling characteristics during combat maneuvering. They were escort fighters, Herr Major. They engaged our interceptors to protect the bomber formation, standard escort doctrine, but executed 800 miles from their bases. The room fell silent as the implications settled across officers who understood fuel consumption mathematics as thoroughly as they understood gunnery principles or formation. Tactics. 800 miles exceeded the Mustang's published range by over 300 miles. Either American propaganda had deliberately understated the aircraft's capabilities, or Allied forces had achieved technological breakthroughs in fuel capacity, engine efficiency, or aerial refueling that German intelligence had completely failed to detect. Hauptmann Gunther Rall, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces, had also engaged American fighters over Berlin that afternoon. His combat report matched Stigler's account with details that made dismissing the observations as pilot error increasingly difficult. The Mustangs were not conserving fuel. They maintained combat power throughout the engagement, pursued our aircraft through sustained turns, and showed no signs of fuel-critical operations. Either they possess double our fuel capacity, or they have achieved consumption rates that our engineering staff considers impossible. The discussion shifted toward explanations that could reconcile observed performance with established technical knowledge. Perhaps the Americans had established forward refueling bases in occupied Europe. Maybe they were using one-way missions where pilots planned to bail out over friendly territory rather than return to England. The possibility that standard Mustang fuel capacity, combined with efficient cruise techniques, could provide 800-mile combat radius was considered and dismissed as mathematically impossible by officers whose careers had been built on understanding aircraft performance parameters. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, recently appointed to command fighter operations in the Berlin defense sector, terminated the speculation with the pragmatic authority of someone who understood that explanations mattered less than tactical responses. Gentlemen, the reason these American fighters reached Berlin is less important than the fact that they are here. Our defensive planning has assumed bomber formations would arrive unescorted, allowing concentrated attacks against aircraft that depend solely on defensive gun positions. That assumption is no longer valid. The implications cascaded through every aspect of Luftwaffe defensive strategy. Bomber formations that had previously suffered devastating losses during unescorted portions of their missions could now be protected throughout their flight profiles. German fighters that had been able to position themselves for methodical attacks against defensive formations now faced escort fighters capable of sustained combat operations over Berlin itself. The fundamental mathematics of air warfare over the Reich had shifted in ways that made previous tactical calculations obsolete. Stigler listened to the discussion with the growing realization that March 6, 1944 represented more than a single combat sortie. It marked the end of German air superiority over their own capital, the collapse of defensive assumptions that geography and fuel limitations would protect Berlin from escorted bomber raids, and the beginning of sustained strategic bombing campaigns that German industrial capacity could not afford. That evening, in quarters that smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke, Stigler reviewed intelligence reports on American fighter operations that had been accumulating since the P-51 entered service. The Mustang had appeared over occupied Europe in late 1943, initially dismissed as another mediocre American fighter that lacked the performance to challenge German interceptors. Early combat reports had confirmed this assessment. The aircraft possessed good speed and acceptable handling, but its limited range restricted operations to areas within 400 miles of English bases. But recent reports, viewed with the perspective provided by that afternoon's combat over Berlin, revealed a pattern that German analysts had failed to recognize. American fighter formations were appearing progressively deeper into Reich airspace, escorting bomber raids to targets that had previously been beyond escort range. The progression had been gradual enough that individual reports seemed like isolated incidents rather than systematic range improvements. Raids to Hanover, Brunswick, and Leipzig had all featured fighter escort that pushed the boundaries of what German intelligence considered possible for Allied aircraft. The technical specifications Stigler reviewed showed the P-51 carried 70 gallons of internal fuel plus two 75-gallon drop tanks, total capacity of 320 gallons, which should have provided combat radius of approximately 475 miles under optimal conditions. The mathematics were straightforward. Fuel consumption at cruise power ran approximately 50 gallons per hour, allowing roughly 6 hours of flight time with minimal reserves. 4 hours of that endurance were consumed simply reaching Berlin and returning to England, leaving just 2 hours for combat operations, loitering time, and navigation corrections. Yet the Mustangs over Berlin had demonstrated fuel reserves far exceeding those calculations. They had engaged in sustained combat maneuvering that consumed fuel at rates double or triple efficient cruise settings. They had maintained combat air patrol positions that required continuous throttle adjustments and maneuvering, and they had faced 4 hours of return flight across hostile territory, where headwinds, navigation errors, or combat damage could easily consume whatever fuel reserves remained. The only explanation that reconciled observed performance with known fuel capacity involved cruise techniques that achieved consumption rates significantly below standard operating procedures. German fighter doctrine emphasized high-power settings that maximized speed and climb performance, accepting reduced range as the cost of superior combat capability. If American pilots were using cruise procedures that prioritized fuel efficiency over performance, they might achieve range extensions that German calculations had not considered possible. Stigler pulled out flight planning calculations, working through fuel consumption scenarios that assumed reduced power settings during cruise flight. At standard cruise power of 2,400 RPM and high manifold pressure, the Mustang's Packard Merlin engine consumed approximately 50 gallons per hour. But if American pilots reduced RPM to 1,800 and accepted slightly lower cruise speeds, consumption might drop to 35 or even 30 gallons per hour. That reduction would extend range by nearly 40%, potentially providing sufficient endurance to reach Berlin with adequate reserves for combat operations. The technique violated every principle of German fighter doctrine. Reducing engine RPM while maintaining cruising flight seemed inefficient, potentially harmful to engine longevity, and contrary to the aggressive power management that characterized successful fighter operations. But if the Americans had discovered cruise procedures that dramatically extended range without compromising combat effectiveness, they had achieved a tactical advantage that fundamentally altered the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. Sleep came slowly that night, interrupted by mental replays of the afternoon's combat and calculations that refused to resolve into comfortable conclusions. Stigler had survived 3 years of aerial warfare by understanding his aircraft's capabilities and his opponent's limitations. The appearance of American fighters over Berlin suggested those limitations had changed in ways that made his accumulated combat experience potentially obsolete. The morning briefing on March 7th revealed that the previous day's bomber raid had not been an isolated incident. Reconnaissance reports indicated substantial American fighter activity throughout northwestern Germany, with multiple sightings of Mustang formations operating well beyond their supposed maximum range. Intelligence officers struggled to explain the observations, using frameworks that assumed German technical knowledge about Allied aircraft remained accurate and complete. Major Hahn opened the briefing with the direct acknowledgement that the previous day's events demanded immediate tactical responses. Until we understand how American fighters are achieving these range capabilities, we must assume bomber formations will arrive with full fighter escort, regardless of target location. Our attack procedures must adapt to this reality. The tactical adjustments seemed inadequate compared to the magnitude of the problem. German interceptors would need to engage escort fighters before attacking bomber formations, consuming fuel and ammunition against targets specifically designed for air-to-air combat. The bomber formations themselves would receive less attention from German fighters occupied with escort battles. and the extended combat operations would increase German pilot fatigue while reducing sortie rates as aircraft required more maintenance between missions. Stigler found himself assigned to standing patrols over Berlin's northern approaches, positioning his squadron to intercept American formations before they reached the capital. The mission profile called for climbing to intercept altitude by 0900 hours and maintaining combat air patrol until relieved by replacement squadrons. 4 hours of flight time, all conducted over friendly territory, with multiple emergency landing options available if fuel or mechanical issues developed. The American pilots flying Escort to Berlin were conducting 8-hour missions over hostile territory with virtually no emergency alternatives. The endurance requirements alone exceeded anything German fighter doctrine considered practical, suggesting either American pilot training emphasized capabilities German instructors had dismissed as impossible, or Allied logistics provided support systems that German intelligence had failed to detect. The patrol sortie on March 7th proved uneventful, with no American formations approaching Berlin during Stigler's assigned period. But the absence of enemy activity provided opportunity for reflection on how thoroughly the previous day's events had undermined assumptions that had seemed unassailable just 48 hours earlier. German air superiority over the Reich had been predicated on mathematical certainties about fuel capacity and operational range. Those certainties had been demonstrated invalid by American fighters flying missions that contradicted every calculation German planning had relied upon. Landing back at Rechlin, Stigler noticed ground crew personnel gathered around a bulletin board, displaying intelligence updates from higher headquarters. The posted information confirmed that March 6th had marked the beginning of systematic American escort operations to Berlin. Multiple bomber raids over the following weeks would feature full fighter protection throughout their mission profiles, ending the period when German interceptors could attack American heavy bombers without opposition during the deepest penetrations into Reich airspace. Technical Sergeant Klaus Müller, a veteran maintenance crew chief who had been servicing fighter aircraft since the Spanish Civil War, offered observations that carried the practical wisdom of someone who understood aircraft systems through daily intimate contact. The Americans are not using different aircraft, Herr Oberleutnant. They are using different techniques with the same aircraft we have been fighting for months. Something changed in their operational procedures that extends range without requiring new technology or equipment. The insight was both obvious and disturbing. If American range improvements resulted from procedural changes rather than technical modifications, German forces could potentially adopt similar techniques with their own aircraft. But that possibility also meant German fighter doctrine had been fundamentally flawed, teaching operational procedures that unnecessarily limited aircraft capabilities, while American pilots exploited performance margins that German training had ignored or dismissed. The institutional implications went beyond tactical adjustments to question how German military aviation had developed its operational doctrines and technical understanding. 3 years of successful combat operations had created confidence that German fighter tactics and aircraft performance represented optimal approaches to aerial warfare. The appearance of American escorts over Berlin suggested that confidence had been misplaced, that alternative operational methods could achieve superior results using comparable technology. Over the following days, intelligence reports accumulated, detailing American fighter operations that pushed progressively deeper into German airspace. Munich, Vienna, and Prague all received bomber raids escorted by Mustang formations that demonstrated range capabilities exceeding German calculations by margins that could not be explained through measurement error or exceptional conditions. Either the Americans had discovered fuel management techniques that dramatically extended operational range, or they possessed fuel technology that provided energy density far beyond what German petroleum chemistry could achieve. Stigler flew 6 more combat sorties during March 1944, engaging American fighters on 4 occasions. Each encounter demonstrated the same pattern. Mustang pilots operated with confidence that suggested substantial fuel reserves remained despite having flown hundreds of miles to reach their combat areas. They maintained aggressive tactics, pursued German interceptors through extended engagements, and showed none of the fuel conservation behavior that should have characterized aircraft operating at maximum range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact on German pilots became increasingly apparent as March progressed into April. Fighter squadrons that had dominated European skies for 3 years now faced enemies who could reach any target in Germany with fighter protection that negated German interceptor advantages. The tactical superiority that German pilots had enjoyed when attacking unescorted bomber formations disappeared when those same formations arrived with escorts capable of sustained combat operations over Berlin, Munich, or any other target the Americans chose to strike. Major Gunther Rahl, whose combat record included over 200 confirmed victories, articulated the frustration that many experienced pilots shared. "We are not being outfought. We are being outmaneuvered by logistics and fuel management that we do not understand. The Americans have solved the range problem while we remain constrained by fuel limitations that apparently only apply to German aircraft." The comment captured a broader truth about how technological and procedural advantages could determine combat outcomes, regardless of pilot skill or tactical doctrine. German pilots possessed extensive experience, capable aircraft, and tactical flexibility developed through 3 years of successful operations. But none of those advantages could overcome the simple reality that American fighters could reach any target in Germany, while German interceptors remained tied to defensive operations over their own territory. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, demanded explanations from technical staffs and intelligence services that struggled to provide coherent answers. The Americans were either using fuel with energy density far exceeding German aviation gasoline, or they had developed cruise procedures that achieved consumption rates German engineers considered impossible. Neither explanation was acceptable to leadership that had been assured of German technical superiority in aviation technology. The captured American pilot provided answers that German intelligence found simultaneously enlightening and humiliating. First Lieutenant Robert Johnson had been shot down over Brunswick on March 23, 1944, his P-51 Mustang suffering engine damage. During an engagement with Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, Johnson had bailed out successfully and was captured by Wehrmacht ground forces within hours, his relatively uninjured condition making him an ideal subject for technical interrogation. The questioning took place in a converted office building outside Frankfurt, where Luftwaffe intelligence specialists conducted interviews designed to extract operational information without violating Geneva Convention protocols regarding prisoner treatment. Johnson, understanding that technical details about publicly known aircraft systems did not constitute classified military intelligence, provided surprisingly candid responses to questions about Mustang fuel management and range capabilities. "We use drop tanks," Johnson explained with the patient tone of someone describing obvious facts. 2 75-gallon external tanks mounted under the wings. They extend our combat radius to approximately 850 miles under optimal conditions. The German interrogators exchanged glances that combined relief with embarrassment. Drop tanks were not secret technology. German fighters had been using external fuel tanks since the Battle of Britain, and Luftwaffe pilots understood perfectly well how auxiliary fuel capacity extended operational range. But German intelligence assessments of American fighter capabilities had somehow failed to account for the Mustang's use of drop tanks during escort missions, focusing instead on internal fuel capacity that naturally limited range to levels that made Berlin seem unreachable. Oberst Werner Baumbach, leading the interrogation team, pressed for additional details that might explain performance observations that still exceeded calculated capabilities even when accounting for external tanks. The drop tanks provide an additional 150 gallons of fuel. That should extend your range, but the combat operations we have observed suggest fuel reserves beyond what 150 additional gallons would provide. Johnson nodded with the understanding of a pilot who had received extensive briefing on fuel management procedures. We also use reduced cruise settings, 1800 RPM, 25 inches of manifold pressure, autolean mixture. Those settings reduce fuel consumption to approximately 35 gallons per hour during cruise flight, significantly below the 50 gallons per hour that high-power cruise consumes. The technical specifications hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. German fighter doctrine emphasized maintaining high-power settings that maximized speed and climb performance, accepting reduced range as an acceptable trade-off for superior combat capability. The concept of deliberately reducing engine power during cruise flight to extend range seemed contrary to fundamental principles of fighter operations, where maintaining maximum performance readiness was considered essential for survival in combat airspace. But the mathematics were undeniable. Reducing fuel consumption from 50 gallons per hour to 35 gallons per hour represented a 30% improvement in efficiency. Combined with the additional 150 gallons provided by drop tanks, those techniques would extend the Mustang's combat radius from 475 miles to approximately 850 miles, exactly sufficient to escort bombers to Berlin and return to England with adequate fuel reserves for combat operations and navigation corrections. Your engine does not suffer damage from operating at reduced power settings during extended cruise flight? Baumbach's question carried genuine technical interest rather than skepticism. German aviation engineering had long maintained that running engines at low RPM with moderate manifold pressure created conditions that could lead to incomplete combustion, carbon buildup, and premature engine wear. We've been using these procedures since January with no unusual maintenance issues, Johnson replied. Engine longevity appears comparable to high-power cruise operations, possibly better due to reduced thermal stress on engine components. The interrogation continued for several hours, extracting details about American fuel management training, drop tank procedures, and operational planning for long-range escort missions. Johnson's responses painted a picture of systematic innovation in fighter operations that German forces had failed to recognize or counter effectively. The Americans had not developed revolutionary new technology. They had simply optimized existing capabilities through procedural improvements that German doctrine had either overlooked or deliberately rejected. Baumbach's report to Luftwaffe headquarters documented findings that raised uncomfortable questions about German fighter training and operational procedures. If American pilots could extend their combat radius by 30% through simple adjustments to cruise power settings, why were German pilots not employing similar techniques? The answer lay in institutional assumptions that high-power operations represented the only acceptable approach to fighter aviation, assumptions that had become doctrine without rigorous evaluation of alternatives. Franz Stigler read sanitized portions of the interrogation report 3 weeks after Johnson's capture, the technical details confirming suspicions that had been forming since March 6. The Americans had not cheated physics or discovered magical fuel sources. They had executed better operational planning, developed more efficient cruise procedures, and implemented auxiliary fuel systems that German forces possessed but had not employed effectively in the fighter escort role. The revelation transformed frustration into something approaching professional respect. American fighter pilots were conducting 8-hour missions over hostile territory using fuel management, techniques that required discipline, precision, and confidence in procedures that contradicted conventional wisdom about fighter operations. The German response to these techniques had been denial, skepticism, and institutional resistance to considering that established doctrine might be fundamentally flawed. Major Hahn convened a squadron meeting in late April to discuss potential adoption of extended-range cruise procedures for German fighter operations. The gathering took place in Rechlin's primary briefing room, where 30 experienced pilots listened to technical presentations about fuel consumption, optimization, and operational planning for long-duration missions. The irony was obvious to everyone present. German forces were receiving instruction on techniques that American pilots had been using successfully for months, while Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed observations as impossible or exaggerated. The Americans have demonstrated that fighters can conduct effective escort operations at ranges we considered impractical, Hahn began, his tone carrying the professional pragmatism of an officer who understood that survival required adapting to new tactical realities. If we are to continue defending Reich airspace against escorted bomber formations, we must understand and potentially adopt similar fuel management procedures. The discussion that followed revealed how deeply cultural assumptions about fighter operations had shaped German tactical doctrine. Experienced pilots expressed skepticism about deliberately reducing engine power during cruise flight, arguing that maintaining maximum readiness required keeping engines at high power settings where immediate combat response was possible. The concept of trading instantaneous performance for extended range seemed contrary to aggressive fighter tactics that had proven successful during 3 years of combat operations. But those successful tactics had been developed for operations over occupied territory, where German fighters enjoyed proximity to friendly airfields, abundant fuel supplies, and the strategic advantage of defensive operations on familiar terrain. The strategic bombing campaign had transformed those conditions, requiring German interceptors to engage enemy formations that arrived with fighter escorts capable of sustained combat operations at any location within Reich airspace. The tactical environment had changed, but German doctrine had not adapted with equivalent speed. Hauptmann Gerhard Barhorn, whose combat record included over 200 aerial victories, articulated the fundamental tension between established practice and necessary adaptation. We are being asked to adopt American techniques because we failed to develop equivalent procedures ourselves. The suggestion carries implications about German fighter training and technical expertise that many pilots will find difficult to accept. The comment captured a broader institutional challenge that extended beyond tactical adjustments to questions of professional identity and organizational culture. German fighter pilots had been trained to view themselves as superior to Allied aviators in skill, aggression, and tactical sophistication. The discovery that American pilots were executing more effective fuel management procedures contradicted that self-assessment, forcing acknowledgement that superiority in some areas did not guarantee superiority in all aspects of fighter operations. Stigler found himself among the minority of pilots willing to experiment with reduced cruise power settings during training flights. The first sortie, using American-style fuel management, felt wrong in ways that went beyond simple unfamiliarity. The engine note changed at reduced RPM, producing sounds that suggested inadequate power rather than efficient cruise. The aircraft's response to control inputs seemed sluggish compared to high power settings, creating the psychological impression that combat readiness had been compromised for marginal improvements in fuel efficiency. But the fuel gauges told a different story. After 90 minutes of cruise flight using reduced power settings, Stigler's Messerschmitt showed fuel consumption approximately 25% below standard high-power cruise. The difference translated directly into extended range that would allow German fighters to conduct longer patrol missions, reach more distant interception points, or maintain combat air patrol positions for additional time before fuel considerations forced return to base. The performance during simulated combat maneuvers proved that reduced cruise settings did not compromise fighting capability when transitioning to combat power. The Messerschmitt's engine responded immediately to increased throttle input, delivering full power within seconds of leaving cruise configuration. Combat effectiveness depended on engine performance during actual engagement, not on power settings maintained during transit to combat areas. American pilots had understood this distinction and optimized their procedures accordingly, while German doctrine had conflated cruise efficiency with combat readiness in ways that unnecessarily limited operational capabilities. Technical Sergeant Mueller, observing Stigler's return from the experimental flight, provided perspective informed by years of maintaining fighter aircraft under diverse operational conditions. The engine shows no unusual wear, Herr Oberleutnant. Operating temperatures remained within normal parameters throughout your flight, and post-flight inspection reveals no problems that would suggest harmful effects from reduced power settings. The maintenance data supported wider adoption of extended-range cruise procedures, but institutional resistance proved more durable than technical objections. Many German pilots viewed American fuel management techniques as symptoms of defensive mentality, rather than legitimate tactical innovations. The argument held that aggressive fighter operations required maximum power settings that kept aircraft ready for immediate combat response, while reduced cruise procedures represented cautious approaches, appropriate for escort duties, but inadequate for offensive fighter missions. The debate became irrelevant as the strategic situation deteriorated throughout spring and summer of 1944. American bomber formations with full fighter escort struck targets throughout Germany with frequency and intensity that overwhelmed Luftwaffe defensive capabilities. German interceptors that attempted to engage bomber formations found themselves fighting through escort screens that could maintain combat operations for hours at ranges that had previously been beyond Allied fighter capabilities. The fuel management techniques that some German pilots had dismissed as overly cautious were enabling American forces to achieve air superiority over Reich territory. By June 1944, the psychological impact on German fighter pilots had become as significant as the tactical disadvantages imposed by American escort capabilities. Stigler flew missions knowing that every bomber raid would arrive with fighter protection, that combat would require engaging enemy escorts before attacking primary targets, and that American fighters possessed range flexibility that allowed them to pursue retreating German aircraft far beyond previous escort limitations. The confidence that had characterized Luftwaffe operations during the early war years had eroded into defensive mentality focused on survival rather than victory. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs, equipped with larger 110-gallon drop tanks in July, further extended American escort range to targets in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and southeastern Germany. The technical progression was methodical and devastating. First came the recognition that drop tanks extended range beyond German calculations. Then the discovery that cruise procedures dramatically improved fuel efficiency. Finally, the implementation of larger external tanks that pushed escort capabilities to cover virtually any target that Allied bombers could reach within European theatre. German attempts to develop counter-tactics focused primarily on attacking American formations during their most vulnerable phases, typically when inbound toward targets, while still carrying heavy fuel loads in external tanks. The theory held that forcing Mustang pilots to jettison their drop tanks during early combat would reduce their fuel reserves and potentially leave them insufficient capacity to return to England. But implementation proved difficult because American fighter tactics emphasized maintaining altitude and position advantages that made such attacks extremely costly for German interceptors. Oberleutnant Heinrich Bahr, flying with Jagdgeschwader 1, achieved one of the few tactical successes against long-range American escorts during a July engagement over Munich. His squadron positioned themselves at high altitude along the inbound route that intelligence predicted American formations would use, then executed diving attacks that forced several Mustang flights to jettison their external tanks while still 300 miles from their home bases. The reduced fuel capacity should have created crisis situations for American pilots facing extended return flights across hostile territory. But post-mission reconnaissance revealed that the affected American fighters had simply reduced their combat patrol time and returned to England without incident. Their internal fuel capacity combined with efficient cruise procedures, providing sufficient range even without external tanks. The mission that should have forced several American fighters to make emergency landings had instead demonstrated that P-51 operations possessed redundancy and flexibility that made them resistant to German counter-tactics focused on fuel consumption. Stigler participated in similar intercept attempts throughout July and August, each mission revealing new aspects of how thoroughly American forces had optimized their long-range escort operations. Fighter formations included designated Pathfinder aircraft equipped with sophisticated navigation equipment that reduced fuel waste from course corrections. Escort tactics emphasized fuel conservation during transit phases, with flights maintaining loose formations that minimized drag and reduced power requirements. Combat air patrol procedures used aircraft in rotation, allowing some flights to maintain station while others conducted high-power combat maneuvers, extending the overall formation's time over target without depleting every aircraft's fuel reserves simultaneously. The attention to operational efficiency extended beyond fuel management to encompass every aspect of long-range fighter escort. American pilots received extensive briefing on emergency landing fields in occupied Europe, providing backup options if fuel situations became critical. Weather routing became sophisticated enough to take advantage of favorable winds during both outbound and return flights. Even radio procedures were optimized to reduce unnecessary communications that might distract pilots from fuel monitoring and navigation duties during 8-hour missions over hostile territory. By September 1944, Luftwaffe defensive capabilities had deteriorated to the point where German fighters could no longer guarantee effective protection for their own territory. American bomber formations struck targets throughout the Reich with impunity, their escort fighters engaging and defeating German interceptors in combat that demonstrated the compounding advantages of superior numbers, better fuel management, and increasingly desperate German defensive tactics. Stigler's last combat mission occurred on September 19, 1944, during a massive American raid against industrial facilities in the Ruhr Valley. His squadron attempted to intercept a formation of B-17 bombers, escorted by what appeared to be over 100 P-51 Mustangs, a numerical advantage so overwhelming that effective attack seemed impossible, regardless of tactical approach or pilot skill. The engagement lasted less than 15 minutes before fuel considerations forced surviving German fighters to break contact and return to their bases, having inflicted minimal damage on the bomber formation, while losing 4 aircraft to American escorts. Landing back at Rechlin, Stigler understood that the mission marked not just a personal defeat, but the effective end of Luftwaffe air superiority over German territory. The Americans had solved the escort fighter range problem through systematic innovation in fuel management, external tank employment, and operational procedures that maximized aircraft capabilities within existing technical parameters. German forces had possessed the same technology but had failed to develop equivalent operational techniques, resulting in strategic disadvantage that could no longer be overcome through pilot skill or tactical adjustments. The technical analysis of why American escort fighters reached Berlin revealed uncomfortable truths about institutional learning and military innovation. Drop tanks were not secret weapons but standard equipment that German forces had been using since 1940. Fuel-efficient cruise procedures required no special technology, just willingness to challenge conventional doctrine about fighter operations. Navigation techniques for long-range missions relied on existing equipment and training that Luftwaffe pilots already possessed. Every component of American long-range escort capability existed within German fighter aviation. What was missing was the systematic integration of these elements into operational procedures that prioritized range extension as equally important as combat performance. The failure to recognize or counter American escort capabilities represented more than tactical oversight. It reflected institutional assumptions that German technical knowledge and operational doctrine represented optimal approaches to fighter aviation, assumptions that discouraged serious evaluation of alternative methods, even when evidence suggested those alternatives might be superior. American pilots flying 8-hour escort missions to Berlin were not performing impossible feats. They were executing practical applications of known technology through operational procedures that German doctrine had either dismissed or never seriously considered. Major Hahn, reviewing squadron combat records from March through September 1944, documented the transformation in stark statistical terms. German fighter effectiveness against American heavy bombers had declined by over 60% during that period, while Luftwaffe losses in air-to-air combat had increased by comparable margins. The trends reflected not a sudden degradation in German pilot quality or aircraft performance, but rather the systematic impact of fighting against enemy formations that arrived with overwhelming escort protection at any target location within European theatre. The human cost of failing to match American fuel management capabilities extended beyond combat losses to encompass psychological impacts on pilots who understood they were fighting with fundamental disadvantages that institutional factors had created. Stigler and pilots like him had been trained to view German aviation as technically superior to Allied forces, a perspective that proved increasingly difficult to maintain when American fighters demonstrated range capabilities that exceeded German calculations by margins that could only be explained through superior operational procedures, rather than better technology. The institutional lessons from the P-51's Escort capabilities would influence military aviation doctrine for decades following the war's end. The importance of fuel efficiency in fighter operations became recognized as equally critical as combat performance, with post-war aircraft designs incorporating considerations for extended range as fundamental requirements rather than secondary characteristics. Training programs began emphasizing fuel management as core competency for fighter pilots, teaching techniques that optimized consumption during non-combat flight phases, while maintaining readiness for immediate transition to full combat power when tactical situations demanded. The strategic bombing campaign's success over Germany during 1944 resulted directly from American ability to provide continuous fighter escort to any target within European theater. That capability emerged not from revolutionary new technology, but from systematic optimization of existing aircraft through operational innovations in fuel management, external tank employment, and mission planning that maximized range while maintaining combat effectiveness. German forces possessed equivalent technology but failed to develop comparable operational procedures, resulting in air superiority loss that contributed significantly to the Third Reich's eventual defeat. Franz Stigler survived the war and emigrated to Canada in 1953, where he eventually became a successful businessman while maintaining connections with former Luftwaffe pilots scattered across North America and Europe. His wartime experiences, particularly the shock of encountering American fighters over Berlin in March 1944, provided perspective on how technological capabilities mattered less than institutional flexibility in recognizing and implementing operational innovations that maximized existing systems. In conversations with other veterans during the post-war decades, Stigler often reflected on how German fighter aviation had been defeated not by superior enemy aircraft, but by superior enemy procedures that optimized conventional technology through innovations that Luftwaffe doctrine had either overlooked or actively resisted. The P-51 Mustang that escorted bombers to Berlin was fundamentally the same aircraft that had been flying limited-range missions in late 1943. What changed was not the aircraft, but rather American understanding of how to employ that aircraft at maximum effectiveness through fuel management techniques that extended range by 30 to 40% without requiring any mechanical modifications. The broader lesson extended beyond aviation to encompass fundamental questions about military innovation and institutional learning. Organizations that assumed their existing doctrine represented optimal practices risked being defeated by adversaries who challenged those assumptions and developed alternative approaches that proved superior under operational conditions. The Luftwaffe's failure to adopt or develop long-range escort procedures comparable to American techniques resulted not from lack of technical capability, but from cultural factors that discouraged serious evaluation of operational methods that contradicted established fighter aviation doctrine. The mathematical simplicity of what American forces achieved made the lesson particularly striking. Reducing engine RPM from 2400 to 1800 during cruise flight, adjusting mixture settings to lean rather than rich, and employing external fuel tanks that German factories were already producing for other applications. These straightforward modifications extended fighter combat radius from 475 miles to 850 miles, transforming the strategic bombing campaign from a marginally effective attrition battle into a devastating assault on German industrial capacity that the Luftwaffe could not prevent or significantly impede. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, whose capture and interrogation had revealed the technical details of American fuel management procedures, was repatriated after the war's end and returned to a career in commercial aviation. He occasionally spoke about his experiences as a prisoner of war, noting that German interrogators had seemed genuinely surprised to learn that drop tanks and reduced cruise settings provided the range extension that had so confounded Luftwaffe intelligence. The disconnect between German technical knowledge and operational awareness suggested institutional problems that went beyond simple intelligence failures to encompass broader questions about how military organizations evaluated and responded to enemy innovations. The story of how P-51 Mustangs reached Berlin represented more than a tactical evolution in fighter escort operations. It demonstrated how systematic optimization of existing capabilities could achieve strategic advantages that exceeded the impact of revolutionary new technologies. American forces did not need to develop fundamentally superior aircraft to achieve air superiority over Germany. They needed only to employ their existing aircraft more effectively through operational procedures that maximized range, fuel efficiency, and combat effectiveness within established technical parameters. German aviation engineering during World War II produced remarkable aircraft that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics, power plant design, and combat performance optimization. But that technical expertise existed within institutional frameworks that proved resistant to operational innovations that contradicted established doctrine about fighter aviation. The result was Luftwaffe forces that possessed capable aircraft flown by experienced pilots using tactical procedures that had been rendered obsolete by enemy innovations in fuel management and mission planning that German doctrine had failed to recognize or counter effectively. The final irony of the long-range escort fighter story was that German forces eventually adopted many of the same techniques that had proven so effective for American operations, but implemented them too late to influence the war's outcome. By late 1944, Luftwaffe training programs included instruction on fuel-efficient cruise procedures, and German fighters began employing external tanks more systematically for extended-range operations. But these adaptations came after Allied air superiority had been firmly established through months of successful bombing campaigns protected by escort fighters that German interceptors could no longer effectively challenge. The transformation of the air war over Europe during 1944 demonstrated how operational innovations could determine strategic outcomes as decisively as technological breakthroughs or numerical superiority. American P-51 Mustangs escorting bombers to Berlin represented the Chattis, convergence of practical engineering, disciplined fuel management, and systematic mission planning that optimized aircraft capabilities through procedures that German forces possessed the technical ability to replicate, but lacked the institutional flexibility to develop or implement in time to prevent strategic defeat. Franz Stigler's experience on March 6, 1944, witnessing American fighters over Berlin, when every calculation indicated such operations were impossible, marked the moment when Luftwaffe air superiority over the Reich became untenable. The specific technical details that enabled American escort operations emerged gradually through intelligence analysis and captured prisoner interrogation, but the strategic reality was immediately apparent. German defensive planning had been predicated on assumptions about Allied fighter range that proved incorrect, and correcting those assumptions required operational changes that German fighter aviation could not implement quickly enough to restore defensive effectiveness. The broader historical lesson transcended the specific circumstances of World War II fighter operations to address fundamental questions about military innovation, institutional learning, and the relationship between technical capability and operational effectiveness. Organizations that assumed their existing practices represented optimal approaches risked strategic surprise when adversaries developed alternative methods that achieved superior results using comparable technology. The key variable was not technical sophistication, but rather institutional flexibility in recognizing and implementing innovations that challenged conventional doctrine. In the final accounting, American long-range fighter escorts over Berlin succeeded not because P-51 Mustangs were dramatically superior to German fighters in combat performance, but because American operational procedures extracted maximum effectiveness from aircraft capabilities through fuel management techniques that extended range by margins German doctrine had considered impossible. The technical knowledge required to achieve those results existed within German fighter aviation, but institutional factors prevented its recognition and application until strategic circumstances had already shifted irreversibly in favor of Allied air forces. The mathematical precision of what American forces accomplished made the achievement both impressive and humbling for German aviation professionals, who later analyzed the Escort fighter operations, reducing fuel consumption by 30% through procedural changes that required no mechanical modifications, implementing external fuel tank systems using existing production capabilities, and optimizing mission planning to take advantage of favorable atmospheric conditions. These practical innovations, executed systematically across hundreds of missions, determined the outcome of the strategic bombing campaign more effectively than technological breakthroughs in aircraft design or engine performance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.